Self-esteem is the disposition to experience oneself as being competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and being worthy of happiness. It is confidence in the efficacy of our mind, in our ability to think. By extension, it is confidence in our ability to learn, make appropriate choices and decisions, and respond effectively to change. It is also the experience that success, achievement, and fulfillment, happiness, are right and natural for us. The survival value of such confidence is obvious. So is the danger when it is missing. A quote by Nathaniel Branden from the Six Pillars of Self-Esteem.
Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers Podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is the best place to get audiobooks on the interwebs, and our book recommendation for this week is super relevant to our conversation. It's The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. This book had a big impact on both of us, and we actually listened to the audiobook while traveling South America in 2014. If you want to go pick up a copy, go to audibletrial.com/theworldwanderers, and you can do a free book and a free month trial.
On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about self-esteem and how travel can really impact your self-esteem in a positive way. And this is a really relevant topic for us because going into our second backpacking trip in South America, we both went down as more low self-esteem people without really realizing that that was the case for us. I think it wasn't until probably like 4 or so months in when we discovered The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. And I can remember being on a plane listening to it being like, whoa, I have low self-esteem, and I had no idea. I thought I was this confident, extroverted person who was really personable and I guess succeeding in life.
Yeah, well, the way you say it makes it seem like you found out you had something, and like as if it was trying to like convince you had it. But no, I think I think a better way to say it may be that like the framework provided by the Six Pillars of Self-Esteem was really helpful in saying, oh yeah, I'm actually dealing with a lot of these problems, and this seems like a root case that underlies a lot of the problems I'm having and is a good model for working on these problems. Does that sound
maybe yeah, maybe that makes a little bit more sense.
Sounds like
I discovered I had a disease or something.
Yeah, did you
found the cure in a book.
Or that the book convinced you had something that you didn't actually have.
WebMD, shout out.
But yeah, so we've talked a lot about how we think travel is a really good environment or is conducive to building self-esteem. I think we've said that like at least 13 times.
I was going to say hundreds, maybe.
So the best way we found to think about self-esteem is kind of this book by Nathaniel Branden, The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. He really popularized the concept, which has since been kind of shifted to mean things which aren't actually referred to. So if you've got a kind of negative like self-esteem that's like hippie bullshit opinion about self-esteem, just hold on with us for a moment and we'll define what we're talking about, because I think that a lot of times it's kind of shifted to mean something else, which is not what we were talking about.
Right. So we defined it the very intro of this podcast with the definition that's used in the Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. Do you want to sort of redefine that in your own words?
Yeah. So the way I've thought about it is kind of self-esteem is kind of that, like when you look in the mirror late at night, you're in the washroom, you see yourself, and like the feeling you have towards yourself. Like, do you look at yourself and have like positive regard? Do you look at yourself and say like, what the fuck, man? Like, what's going on here? What are you doing with your life? Like, I'm wasting my potential. Those are kind of...
Or do you even like make eye contact with yourself? I think that's a big one that was really resonant for me when some of the exercises were like stare at yourself, and I was realizing how much I was looking at like the features of my face or the clothes I was wearing or parts of my body, but I wasn't really like looking into my own soul, like looking into your eyes and seeing what's truly there.
Yeah. And I think a big distinction to make is what is not self-esteem. So thinking that your better than other people and having a model of the world that's relying on saying, oh, I'm better than X, I'm better than Y, I'm better than all these people, that's not self-esteem. Being, I don't know, what would be a good word for that?
Ego?
Being like arrogant, condescending, like that's not self-esteem. So self-esteem is more of an internal thing. How do you feel about yourself? And I feel like a really good way into this is the question, do you feel like you're living up to your potential?
Right.
If you answer that question and say, there's things I can improve, but I feel quite good about how I'm doing, I think that hints at positive self-esteem. If you think that, no, I don't feel like I'm living up to my potential, I think that hints at poor self-esteem. And so for me, my personal experience was kind of like thinking that I'm not living up to potential, kind of feeling like a failure in so many ways. But doing that, having this model in my head where I would kind of tear down the people around me. And
so like comparison towards other people.
Yeah. So my whole view of my value as a person was externalized, and it was about, how do I compare to everyone around me? And so since you're working in that model, you can say, oh, I feel like I'm better than X person for X reason. I feel like I'm better than Y person for this reason. Stuff like that. So I felt like my self-esteem was high, but
it's pseudo self-esteem, as Nathaniel Branden calls it.
Pseudo self-esteem is the word he uses for it. And that's something that I really related to, this experience of thinking that since I could convince myself that I was better than people, that I had good self-esteem, which definitely wasn't the case because my relationship with myself was very poor.
Yeah. And that's definitely when I described, sort of not very descriptively, but when I was talking about how I can remember where I was on a plane, like listening to Nathaniel Branden's The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem and being like, whoa, this relates to my life. That's the exact moment. He describes self-esteem. He describes what it is and what it is not. And he describes what most people think of as self-esteem and why most people don't think that they need to work on their self-esteem. And he calls it the pseudo self-esteem. And I was like, hot damn, like that's what's going on with me. I've got this pseudo self-esteem where I've created this whole identity and this ego around who I am. And I use my friends and coworkers and I compare myself and I put myself on a scale compared to them, using this really external stuff to sort of feel certain ways. And
it's like, would you say like trying to make yourself feel secure?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
I'm okay because...
Yeah. I'm okay because, so-and-so is not doing as well as me in their career. I'm okay because so-and-so is fatter than me. So it's fine that I didn't go to the gym today, as opposed to having all of that stuff come from your internal feelings and needs. And there's a quote that I really love. I don't know the exact quote, but something about like happiness comes from within. So you can never really find true happiness when you seek it externally. And I think that that's also... that makes me think of self-esteem. You can't really find or develop higher self-esteem if you're always looking outside for it.
Yeah, there's a really good quote from Nathaniel Branden. And it goes, if I aim to prove I am enough, the project goes on to infinity because the battle was already lost on the day I conceded the issue was debatable.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fabulous quote. And just to sort of, I guess, summarize that in layman's terms, is that the right way to say that?
Well, I feel like it's pretty understandable.
Okay, I'll just leave it then. No, I think it's like pretty good.
But yeah, that's kind of the idea you're talking about, where when you go out and you think who you are and like your value as a person is dependent on how you compare to the people around you, that just has terrible I don't know. What's the opposite of enriching?
Unenriching.
Maybe. Consequences, because you want to be around people who don't threaten you. When your friends do good things, you're kind of motivated to tear them down. You're threatened by people's success. And no matter how much you improve, if the group of peers changes, you're always going to think like, oh, what's wrong with me? I can't.
Yeah. And I think that that's going down a really sort of like dangerous rabbit hole, because there's another sort of idea concept. I feel like we're quoting a lot in this episode, which we don't usually do, but I think that's just what it's going to be like in this episode. But it's been said that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So if you are somebody who has lower self-esteem and you've surrounded yourself by people who also deal with low self-esteem, or who you can compare yourself on a scale and feel better than, you're probably not in a very good place, because you're going to be the average of those 5 people that you call your best friends. And they're perhaps really not building you up in a positive way.
Yeah. And it's funny because the tendency is that when you are doing that to the people you're like, let's say you're quite low self-esteem, you're trying to like build yourself up externally by comparing yourself to your friends, kind of tearing them down, creating this worldview where you're better than the people around you. The people you tend to associate also think the same thing, which is kind of a funny consequence of it. So you end up in a group of people where everyone's kind of like tearing each other down, and it's like this fight at the bottom of the barrel. Everyone's like kind of climb up and support themselves off of each other.
Yeah. It makes me think of like, I don't know, like bottom feeders at the bottom of the ocean that like live off bacteria or something. Yeah,
or just like a bunch of people in water trying to like support themselves on the bodies of other people around them.
Oh, that's a bad image.
No, like everyone's still alive, but like, you know what I mean?
Oh, okay, yep. Seeing it different now.
And it's like your survival comes at the expense of other people, instead of just being in enriching relationships where everyone builds each other up and knows that they're not threatened by the people around them, and knows that getting success from hurting the people around them isn't going to make them feel good in the long term.
So in Nathaniel Branden's book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, he breaks up the concept of self-esteem into 6 main practices. And these 6 different things are things that we're going to break down in this episode. And we're going to talk about each individually, and specifically how with each of them, travel can play a really positive influence. I mean, we're about 10 minutes into the episode and you're like, where's the travel? It's coming. Stay with us. We're going to talk about it as we begin breaking down each of these elements.
Yeah, so we're going to go through, talk about, just kind of briefly intro that practice, and then talk about how travel is a good environment, or an environment conducive to building that practice and thus building self-esteem. Obviously, we're not going to get too deep into the self-esteem stuff. Definitely worth checking out the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem or some of Nathaniel Branden's other work. But from here on out, we're going to focus on kind of the practical travel stuff as that applies to self-esteem.
Totally.
So the 6 practices are living consciously, self-acceptance, self-responsibility, assertiveness, living purposefully, and integrity. And they kind of build upon each other. So living consciously is really a foundation that self-acceptance is built upon, and self-acceptance is a foundation that responsibility is built upon. Living consciously and self-acceptance are your acceptance of reality as it is. So everything else kind of builds upon that.
So the first pillar is, or the first practice is living consciously. And living consciously can be defined as being present to what you're doing, being present to your surroundings, and essentially living in a conscious manner. Yeah,
so if you're into yoga or meditation, I think presence is a really good word you can substitute in for living consciously, but it's just noticing what's going on in your life, noticing the thoughts you have in your head, noticing the feelings, and going through your day like a human being instead of a zombie. Not on autopilot.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because I think that most of us are sort of in zombie mode generally. And I know that it's something that I can really relate to when I was working a corporate job in Calgary, and my alarm went off at the same time every day. I had the same routine. I remember I walked to the C train, and then I would get on the train with all the rest of the people in zombie mode, and nobody would talk to one another or look at one another, because it's too early for that, and we have to go into our offices. And I would just go about my day in sort of like this mindless fashion. And I think that's why travel was so exciting for me. It was this break from reality. It was this break from the things that were mundane and kind of boring and kind of the same every single day in my life. And to me, living consciously is the benefits of travel for living consciously are so obvious, because you get somewhere that's new and exciting and a different culture, and you're completely overstimulated. And sometimes it feels like a bad way, but I think it really is a good way.
Yeah, and it's not, everything's novel, so you're interacting with it in a much deeper way, because it's not something you've seen before. You haven't built all these routines around your life. So going out to get coffee in the morning when it's your first day in Bogota and you're like, oh my God, everything's novel, which is a really good, deep experience while you're there. But when you're at home working, got a ton of responsibilities, that kind of childlike sense of the world around you can kind of disappear really quickly. If you're driving the same way to work every day, doing similar tasks every day, you can just automate, and your thoughts become routine, everything becomes routine, and you don't notice things that are happening in your life.
Totally. And I remember touching about this, or on this briefly, in our Canmore and Banff episode, talking about how beautiful this place that we call home right now is, and where we lived before we went down to Atlanta, and how the mountains are so spectacular, but sometimes it takes a moment to be like, oh, right, we live here. These mountains are beautiful, because even that becomes everyday life. It becomes normal to see this spectacular beauty and lose that sense of appreciation and excitement about it that you had when you first moved there, or you first got there.
Yeah, this is something that's been big coming back here, is like, oh, wow, the views are so incredible and so amazing. And I feel like I wasn't appreciating it at the end of 15 months here. And now that it's been 3 months, you do kind of feel it fading again. You're like, oh yeah, that's what the view looks like. It's not like, oh my God. And I think like there's a value in it, right? Like losing this kind of sense of wonder or awe at normal things around you is efficient from a getting stuff done standpoint. And obviously you can't be fully present with what you're doing all of the time every day, because you need to be thinking about other things while you're driving sometimes, or you want to be listening and learning something. But I think one of the big consequences of that is this kind of like time warp that people experience traveling versus being at home. This is the kind of thing where you go traveling and you're like 6 months went by and it went by quickly, but it felt like a way deeper, way longer experience, versus being at home when you're kind of working for the weekend and you're like, holy crap, a year went by. Like,
yeah, totally.
It's kind of funny because it has the dynamics are, while you're traveling, each passing moment is a lot more enjoyable, but it seems like it's going by quickly. But then afterwards you look back at it and like, wow, that was really felt like a long period of time. Felt like that 6 months took up a long amount of my life, or an outsized portion of my life, versus when you're working or maybe doing something you don't like to do, moments can feel excruciating. Like, wow, this day is just never going to end. But then on the long term, you're like, holy crap, what happened to the last like year and a half of my life?
Right.
It just was like, boom, gone in a flash.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point that I can relate to 100%. And something I also think about with living a conscious or present life is being able to go back to moments and not just remember where you were, but remembering how you felt. So how you felt like in your body, what you were thinking about then. And I find that, I really like photos. Photos are a great way for me to remember memories. And I find that there's photos where I can look at them and I'm almost like transported back to that moment. So it's like, I'm standing in front of the Eiffel Tower and I remember what the temperature was like, what the air felt, the noises around me, how I felt in that moment. And then I can look at, photos with friends just another night out, and I don't really have any like concept of that because I wasn't as present. It was sort of just like this thing that I did.
Yeah, being fully engaged with something allows you to remember it a lot better.
Yeah, and it's
also,
sort of, you're present like with the way that your body feels. So like physical, emotional, mental sensations within yourself.
Yeah, and also take lessons from the experience, to kind of think and apply what you're learning. If you have like a bad experience at work one day and then kind of makes you feel unsettled, and then you kind of go home, turn on TV, days go by, weeks go by, you kind of forgotten about it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're conscious, you're like, oh, something feels weird right now. I'm going to do some introspection about it. So that's like living consciously is opening yourself up to signals that can lead to further introspection and further learning.
And so the second practice or pillar of self-esteem that we're going to talk about is self-acceptance. And self-acceptance is defined as the willingness to own, experience, and take responsibility for our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And it's the idea of giving permission to think one's own thoughts.
So how has travel helped you with self-acceptance, Amanda Kingsmith?
So the thing that comes to mind to me is actually on our very first backpacking trip together, we arrived in England after going to Iceland, and we arrived at this pretty like quirky, cool hostel. And I remember us being in this 12-bed dorm room, and we were only 3 nights into our trip. So, you know, we hadn't really been on the road for very long. And there was this guy there who was like just one of the strangest people I think I've ever met. He was like doing a really strange backpacking trip, and he was, I think, a musician maybe, and had been traveling around the UK and all these things that were so foreign to me at the time, where I was like, you do this? Like, what do your parents think about that? Like, you didn't go to university? Like, what's wrong with you? And I was very used to kind of defining myself based on my external reality and my external world and comparing myself to others.
What does that mean?
Sort of what we talked about in the beginning, where self-esteem is very outwardly driven versus inwardly driven is how it actually should be, how your self-esteem should be. And so I was very used to defining myself based on other people. So I'm immediately like, oh, this guy's not cool. Like, I wouldn't associate with this guy. But he was in our dorm room for a couple days. And so, you know, we just kept chatting, and I don't want him to steal my stuff. So I'm trying to be polite and create rapport. And then I was like, oh, this guy's actually kind of cool. Because it was the first time in years and years where I wasn't worried about my social hierarchy, and I wasn't worried about if I was being cool or not. And I had this moment of like, oh, I can kind of just be myself in these situations, and I don't have to worry about what other people are going to think, and I don't have these expectations from other people to be a certain way. And to me, that's sort of like the first step of self-acceptance, is not trying to be what other people want you to be and just being who you are. Mm-hmm. Just accepting, you know, that you have weird, quirky things about you, and that you like things that maybe everyone else doesn't like, and that it doesn't really matter. You're just who you are. You think what you think, and you do what you do.
Yeah, and this is a great lesson that you learn from staying in hostel dorm rooms, especially if you're moving quite often, because there's just kind of this revolving cast of characters in your life, and you learn to not be, when it's just like there's no incentive to try to be cool in people's eyes when you're constantly meeting new people. Like, all that pressure to change who you are kind of disappears, so you kind of just naturally start acting more from an authentic place. Like, what do I want to act like? Not even really thinking about it, just doing it instead of thinking and being anxious about what people think. I think a really big point to make for self-acceptance as well isn't necessarily like you need to be okay or happy with everything, but just accepting that things are the way they are as it comes to you. So
totally. That's a really great point to bring up, that like everything's not rainbows and butterflies and sunshine, and that's okay too. Yeah.
So like you may have regrets from the past, things that you didn't like doing. And it's definitely cool to be like, oh, hey, I didn't like doing that, but accepting that it happened. And the same thing applies to physical appearance. It applies to just like other traits about yourself, like you are the way you are, and you have to like first be cool with that before you can change it. And saying something like, oh, hey, I don't feel like great about the way I look, but I look the way I look, is an important nuance to make, I think.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And how do you think that travel has helped you to sort of like accept those things about yourself?
I think for me, the big thing from travel is the space to go back and deal with events and thoughts and stuff like that that I was capable of ignoring while I was at home, super busy, super routine, always have work to worry about and tons of stuff to worry about. When that stuff goes away and you're just traveling, you're just trying to enjoy yourself for month after month, those thoughts kind of recur naturally to you. I know this is an experience a lot of people have where kind of like almost like demons people have been running away from kind of come to confront them when they do have space, which is why so many people stay busy all the time.
Right.
So for me, having space allowed me to go back, think about some of these things, and then kind of get to the point where I was like, yeah, it happened. This is why it happened. I don't feel great about it. I would do it differently now, but I understand why it happened.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something interesting to think about with that is I was talking to a girl at work the other day, and she did a 140-kilometer paddleboarding trip on the Saskatchewan River. And for those of you who are not familiar with Canadian landscape, Saskatchewan's very straight. So she said she looked at a lot of the same landscape like over and over. So at some point your brain stops like sort of processing the things you're seeing because it's so similar. And you start being like forced to deal with these things that you didn't want to think about before. And she said that was one of the biggest challenges. She was on this floating device in the water, sometimes talking to other people, but a lot of times just by herself with her own thoughts. There was nothing to distract her. And it's not an easy thing. It's definitely not an easy thing to think about the things that you've been running away from in your head. But I think that, like you said, when you can come to terms with them and be okay with them, you're kind of on a next level, and you're on the level where you can begin actually making like real solid changes to your life.
Yeah. I think another big thing for travel is just separating yourself from your current social circle allows you to change in a lot of ways. I think a lot of the motivation to reject ourselves, and we kind of hinted at this with looking cool in the eyes of others, but when you're trying to fit into a group, that's a lot of the times what causes you to reject some kind of fundamental stuff about the way you are. Your need to connect or fit into a group can kind of motivate you to say, oh, I look wrong, or I think about things that aren't right, or like, why do I think these thoughts? Stuff like that. Can you relate to that?
Yeah, definitely. It made me think about this, like, your group of friends who knows you really well kind of knows you as a certain person. They know you do certain things. And so I think a big thing for me was like for a while wanting to be like drinking less alcohol, but feeling like it was really difficult because my friends had this expectation of like, oh, well, she will go out and do this. She'll go out and have a good time. And then when you're traveling and you're in like a hostel and you're with like new people and they're like, oh, hey, do you want to come out? And you're like, no, I'm good tonight. And they're like, okay, cool. Like, see you tomorrow then. It's like, there's no like peer pressure. There's no like, what's your problem? Like, why don't you want to do this? Like, I'm counting on you type thing. It's just this like different set of expectations. And by different set, it's like essentially no expectations, which can be really freeing and can really help you to sort of like accept your decisions and become more confident in making them in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you say it's fair to say that a big part of self-acceptance when you're traveling comes from just like separating yourself from your life at home?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely. So the third pillar or practice of self-esteem is self-responsibility. And the way that Nathaniel Branden defines this is that we are the author of our choices and actions, and it's not who's to blame, but what needs to be done. And a quote that I really like from the book that he says is, often what we call thinking is merely the recycling the opinions of others. And I think that that's a really great way of putting this concept of self-responsibility, is that oftentimes we think that we're being, I guess, responsible for our own thoughts or feelings, but we're actually repeating the things that we heard from our parents or the media or what our friends said, and we're not actually thinking about what is our own. And so in order to be taking responsibility for yourself, for your thoughts, for your actions, you're not blaming other people, you're not causing guilt to other people, you're really being the person who's behind these things.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that for me comes up, and kind of the best analogy about self-responsibility is just, you are not a puppet. Your actions are always justified by something else someone else did, instead of saying, oh, I'm choosing to be like this right now. It's, this person did that, I'm so offended, or I can't believe they did that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think about sort of like social settings and work settings, especially where it's like he said, she said, kind of like pushing responsibility off onto other people. Like I think about, if you call like a customer support line and you're trying to get help with something that went wrong, and you get passed from like person to person who's like, oh, I actually don't take care of that. Let me pass you on to like the next, department, and that department doesn't want to help you either. And there's like nobody that will take responsibility for the thing that they did wrong in like your, like say if your product's damaged or something like that, or you've had a bad experience. Yeah.
So that's absolutely one way. And then also just taking responsibility for just like day-to-day life, knowing that just because someone does something for you, and maybe because they've done it for a while, doesn't mean that you have any right to receive these things from other people. So I think a big thing for traveling, especially at a young age, is when you go out there and you're on your own, this removes a lot of the crutches that you can get used to having at home. So if you're living near your parents and you still rely on your parents to provide you grocery money, you still rely on your parents to provide you with, I don't know, gifts, emotional support, and with friends especially. Like if you rely on friends to make plans for you, if you rely on friends because you're too introverted to go out and meet new people, or if you rely on friends to provide emotional support, getting out there, going traveling, new country, you're kind of thrown into a situation where all these crutches you've used are removed, and it allows you to kind of perceive the ways that you weren't taking responsibility for your own life, and kind of practice taking responsibility, knowing that if you want something to happen, there's no one who's going to do it for you.
Yeah, I think that improved self-responsibility is probably one of the biggest things that happens if you go on a trip, especially somewhere that's like a developed or a developing country.
And especially solo as well.
Yeah, especially solo. And it's something that happens, I think, without really realizing it. Like it doesn't seem as obvious to me. Like when I look at like living consciously or self-acceptance, I see the obvious connection to travel. And for me, making notes before the podcast, self-responsibility was probably one of the least obvious ones. But I think that it's the one that's going to most definitely happen for you, because you go and all of a sudden you realize that you rely on all these different people in your life to do these things for you. And you're like, shit, man, I'm kind of like on my own for this. Like I've got to do this for myself, or it's not going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. I think that living consciously is a very natural, inherent part about traveling, but also self-responsibility. I do think that self-responsibility does vary depending on how your trip is. Going somewhere, like you said, that it's a developing country is going to put you into more situations where you have to deal with issues and be reliant on yourself. And also, depending on the group you're with, if you go with 4 friends, you're just not going to be as responsible because you have people with you, which definitely isn't a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But if your goal is to use travel as a way to improve yourself or to travel as personal development, if that's your goal, going solo really forces you to be responsible for yourself. But when we traveled together, we definitely fell into roles.
Mm-hmm.
So you think farther in advance. So you do a lot more planning, booking hostels, booking train tickets, a lot of that logistical stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the assertiveness side, when we first started traveling together, you were a lot more extroverted than I was. So when we'd go out and try to meet people, like go down to the hostel bar, I would kind of rely on you to go out and make some of these, and go, say hi to people, meet new people. And this kind of flows into the next one, self-assertiveness, which we can get into in a minute, but just responsibility. Going by myself, traveling in Eastern Europe was like, okay, like there's nobody here. It's just me. Like if I want to hang out with people, I got to go do it. And if I want to leave this town, I got to go book my ticket. And kind of opens up this world to you where you're like, oh, hey, like there was a lot of people I've been relying on, and I maybe haven't been appreciating them as much.
Yeah, because I think that you don't realize how much you rely on them. I think it's like you usually find people that you can rely on the same way you rely on your parents or your siblings when you live at home. You find people that can really mirror those things for you. So if your mom like consistently like took you to birthday parties and, you know, waited till you were comfortable and introduced you to people, you might find somebody as a partner who's going to do the exact same thing to you. And I'm not saying that's your situation. I'm just using that as an example as, you know, what that type of thing might look like. And, you know, being on your own or being with one other person even can be can't really rely on other people to like make my life happen for me. And that's why I think that the wording that Branden uses is so beautiful. Like, we are the author of our choices and actions. It's like, pick up the pen and write your own story and stop letting other people do it for you.
Yeah. And that, like, when you think about it, that's like the puppet thing, right? Like, you're not a puppet getting pushed around by the universe. Like, you have the power to respond in numerous ways. You have the power to make decisions about how your life's going. This is like people who say, oh, I can't leave my job. I can't go traveling, or I can't find a job that I really like. It's like, yes, it's within your realm of possibilities. You could take responsibility for that. And also how you respond to situations. So practicing self-responsibility is saying, no matter what happens outside of me, I have the power to make a decision about how I'm going to respond to this.
Right. And I think that another thing that can be really positive from travel is if you're maybe like a consistent yes man, you really learn to exercise your power of no. And I'm not thinking, I guess I'm thinking a little bit about myself, but I'm also thinking about one of my close friends who has like consistently been a yes man or a yes woman her entire life. And something that I noticed to be a really positive change in her after she did a year abroad was that she came back and she exercised her power of saying no to friends who once sort of controlled her life in a big way. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing when you can say no to people without worrying that they might not be your friend anymore. Because it's like, friends who stop being friends because you said no to one thing with them are probably not friends that you want anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that I can relate to as well, is, you know, standing my ground a little bit more and being like taking responsibility for my life instead of doing things that I didn't really want to do. Started just saying no to them. I think you did the same thing as well.
Yeah.
So that flows nicely into the fourth practice or pillar.
Number 4,
which is self-assertiveness. And the way that Branden defines this is being authentic in our dealings with others, not faking who we are. And so he kind of defines it a little bit different than, you know, I guess the traditional sense of being assertive. I think that being assertive kind of has a couple different things. It can look like asking for the things you want and being who you are, but really like standing up for yourself. So it really flows in nicely with self-responsibility. And I like that the two kind of come after each other because they really do build on one another. It's like you begin writing your own story and then you begin being more authentic when you make requests.
Yeah, it seems like assertiveness is kind of the natural actions that proceed from taking responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the biggest thing about becoming more assertive or taking self-assertiveness is having more space. And this kind of flows from going from like a yes man to a no man, or exercising the power of no, is like recognizing that, you know, I don't actually really like doing this, so I'm going to not do it. Mm-hmm. And being assertive enough and confident enough in myself to be like, no, I don't want to do that. Thank you though. And that can be a really empowering thing. Would you agree?
Yeah, so I think this is a big thing about traveling, is you wake up each day and you're kind of focused on, what do I want to do today? Instead of living a life of obligation, you're kind of getting in tune with what you actually enjoy and want to be doing. And then the practice that comes from that is being able to say, oh, you know what? That's not actually what I want to do.
Yeah, and Branden says in his definition of self-assertiveness that it's standing up for ourselves in an appropriate way. And the thing that I think about with travel is that you really can practice this because you have nothing to lose. You don't have friends that might defriend you when you say no, that you don't want to go out or you don't want to go for lunch or whatever. So because they're sort of like these 5-minute friends that you meet in hostels and you kind of just get to know on like basic questions. And there's really nothing to lose when you're like, no, thank you. Like, or yeah, I would like to do that. Or no, I don't feel like going out and drinking tonight. And I think that that's a really, really powerful thing that can come from traveling.
Yeah. And the other thing that really comes to mind for me when we think about assertiveness is learning a language and the power that has to help you with being more assertive at home. Because you don't really realize it, but language is a big way to be passive in your communication with people and in your interactions with people. You can say stuff like, oh, hey, do you think that maybe possibly you could do this thing for me? Whereas when we were out in South America learning Spanish, our language was so at such a basic level that we couldn't help but be assertive with people. If you need to go somewhere because you're traveling, you're in a place you don't understand, and you're learning a language where you don't know how to be passive, you've just got to be assertive, because a lot of times being assertive is the same thing as being straightforward with people.
Right.
Passivity is complex. Assertiveness is very straightforward. So that's like, where is bathroom? Or give me coffee, please. Those kind of things from learning Spanish really forced me to realize how uncomfortable with being assertive I was.
Right. Well, it's so societal in our language to be like, could I please have a coffee with milk? And in Spanish, you would say, me das un café con leche, por favor. Like, give me a coffee with milk, please. And it's just like they skip all of the sort of like extra words that we put in there to make it sound more like eloquent and nice and fluffy. And part of that is like Canadian culture. I think it's the whole like, we're a nice, polite people. And it's like, yes, that's great on one hand, but on the other hand, it's like, why don't we just say what we actually want and be straightforward about it? Yeah.
And this is the thing about living at home versus going traveling that really allows you to practice assertiveness, is that when you're at home, you're in a routine, you're comfortable, you're not really dealing with too many situations where you don't know what's going on or where you don't know how to interact with people, and where you actually need to say like, oh, hey, how do I do this? Or, oh, hey, I actually need this. When you're traveling, if you're learning a language, that's a big help. But also just going out and dealing with tour operators and hostels and finding your way around a new city, all these things kind of force you to be assertive. I remember the very first time we went anywhere, we arrived in Iceland, very first time out of the country. Well, not really.
But like, what?
On our first backpacking trip. And we were on the bus, and people are getting off the bus, and we're like, do we stay on the bus? Do we get off the bus? I don't know. No one's speaking English, so we just have to go up and be like, yo, I don't know where we're going. Like, find someone who speaks English, ask the question, make sure we're going to the right place. Turned out we needed to get off the bus. But I remember like right from day one when we were traveling, being forced to get outside of my comfort zone and be assertive about making sure getting what we need.
Yeah. And even though I'm like naturally a little bit more extroverted than you, I remember it being quite uncomfortable for me as well. Like I have so many memories of us sort of like either sitting on like a bus, a plane, or a train, or like standing in a corner kind of being like, you go ask. No, you go ask. I asked last time. No, you go ask.
Yeah. Especially in South America where we were both dealing with like not knowing Spanish and having to go up and look kind of like an idiot at the same time.
Like, how do I say this? Okay, let me practice. Okay, it's your turn to go ask though. You go ask. Okay, let's practice. And like practicing it and then finally going up and being like, ¿Dónde está el baño? It's like so basic. It's just, I don't know. It's such an interesting thing to see yourself go through and to see how you deal with things when you're put outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, and this is another example where solo travel is so huge as a personal development activity. It's uncomfortable a lot of the time, but when you're by yourself, you can do nothing but be assertive. If you're in the wrong place, if you're trying to get something that you need, there's still a dynamic where maybe if you really want something and you're afraid to ask for it, so you just don't. Like that still happens. But when you go out traveling, you get to practice daily being assertive in a way that you don't when you're at home. And that's all of these things are about. It's not about a yes-no thing. It's a spectrum where you kind of practice doing that thing more. And as you practice all of these things more, you kind of build this inherent sense of trust in yourself. And that also just builds self-esteem.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really important to note here is that it's not like you become a master of this because you do it traveling. I think that self-esteem in general is something that is sort of a consistent working thing that you're always going to need to be improving on. But
well, maybe not improving, but it's going to have ups and downs. It's going to trend down sometimes and you're going to be like, oh, what's going on? And then you're like, oh, wait, I'm actually not taking responsibility. I'm actually being passive, stuff like that.
Right. But my point is that, travel isn't like going to make you, if you're sitting at home being like, oh, I have some like low self-esteem that it seems like I should improve upon. It's like travel will definitely improve that. It doesn't make it like 100% though. It's just ways that we've seen improvement. And I just wanted to note that just based on what you said.
Yeah. And the last point on assertiveness, but it goes like hand in hand with responsibility. Asking for what you need kind of implies, this kind of comes from everything before it, right? Like when you're conscious and accepting, this means you're noticing how you feel, you're accepting how you feel, you're taking responsibility for how you feel. But then when you need something, you ask for it. Like if you're feeling lonely and you're traveling by yourself and there's some people in the hostel and they're going for dinner and you're like, oh, I really want to go out with these people, and you accept that and you're like, okay, well, it's not their responsibility to ask me. I'm not going to get offended because they didn't ask me. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to do what I maybe need. You have a need to connect with people. So you're like, yo, are you guys going out for dinner? Like, can I join you? Is that cool? Mm-hmm. That's like a really assertive move, but that's kind of follows from everything up to this point.
Yeah, totally. And something on the same like wave of thought there is if you're sick. If you're sick and you're alone and you're in a foreign country, there's probably almost nothing worse. And I think that it's really important to ask for what you need.
All right, on to the fifth pillar of self-esteem, living purposefully. Living purposefully.
And so living purposefully is identifying goals or purposes and what we need to attain them.
That's a little bit abstract.
All of this is abstract.
But, true. Some of them, like living consciously, is pretty clear. Assertiveness, clear.
Okay.
Living purposefully, though, that's a bit abstract, but I think everyone kind of has some interaction with how when you feel a strong sense of purpose in your life, you just feel better. And when you feel like that's gone, it's a little bit tougher to wake up in the morning to get onto stuff.
Right.
And so a lot of people might think at first, like, how is long-term backpacking helping you with the practice of living purposefully?
Totally. And when you go from something that's kind of occupying all of your mental space and maybe even your like physical space as well, you have just space in general to sort of begin thinking about like, what do I actually like doing? What are my dreams? What are my goals? What do I want to do with my life? And I know we've talked quite a bit on the podcast about how travel was sort of the first time for us where we saw these different ways of living outside of how we've been brought up. And both of us were brought up very similarly and sort of like typical nuclear families. We went to public school, we went to university, and we were kind of on this track to, have jobs and buy a house and get married and have babies and then retire and who knows what after that. And travel was the first time where it's like this space and time to reflect on like, is that really what I want?
Yeah. And so it's kind of identifying this feeling of like feeling really engaged and alive. So feeling conscious. Mm-hmm. And then thinking like, okay, there's got to be something more than going back to kind of monotony. And I think that this is one of the things that travel is really valuable for, because it helps you address kind of bigger questions that you might not get to until you're 50 if you just kind of follow a conventional path. Like, yeah, traveling this is stuff we kind of talked about in the Cult of Travel episode, but traveling as an end in itself, just like traveling around forever, isn't going to give you a strong sense of purpose. But getting that space to think about, what do I really want out of my life? Which, if you're at home and you're just working and you're bogged down in responsibilities and every single day is about random tasks, that's how you avoid thinking about those questions. So
Right.
Travel is a great way to open yourself up to those questions.
Yeah, it gives you the space to consider them, and then it also gives you the opportunity to think sort of outside of the box, to think like within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, and also I think one of the things that is beneficial about it, which people use as a criticism of travel, but I think is actually a benefit of travel, is that it allows you to confront the feeling of purposelessness. So this is a big lesson from traveling South America for us, where we were traveling and kind of a month and a half into it, we weren't really practicing Spanish that much. We were like kind of just decompressing, and you kind of get this feeling inside of like something's missing.
Yeah.
Like, this is like fine, but I don't feel satisfied. And in a way that hadn't happened the first time we traveled, where we are more just on a, long-term vacation, partying, having fun. But this time I was like, okay, something's missing. Like, I don't have a sense of meaning. Like, I'm not doing anything. And so we were kind of looked at, what skills do we want to build? Like, how do we want to change our lives? So once we started digging into personal development stuff, reading a lot, practicing Spanish, and you're like, oh, hey, when I notice myself improving at Spanish and can see progress in all these areas of my life, I feel like I've got a stronger sense of purpose. And then you find things that you're passionate about because you've got space, and you come home and think, okay, this is what I want to do. And this is a story that so many people have had that we've talked to, where it's like, oh, I went on this trip and I realized that what I was doing before isn't actually what I want to do, that I don't really like it, and I'm going to try to do the thing I actually want to do.
Right. Yeah, totally. I agree with that.
But having space to realize how important purpose is to feeling satisfied with your life is, I think, a big lesson from travel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I know that Akaisha and Billy talked about that in the Retire Early Lifestyle episode, where they'd been working so hard when they retired that they just went to an island where there was nothing to do, and they did nothing until they were bored.
Yeah.
And then they figured out what they wanted to do after that. And it's sort of this idea of decompressing from all the things that you use to distract yourself in your daily life until you're at the point where you are literally bored to death and you're like, I need to figure out something to do. And then finding something that really drives you, that makes you tick, that makes you feel alive. And I feel like that's the idea of like living purposefully.
Yeah, it's a great anecdote for like the lottery mindset, which is like the person working the job they don't really like, and they're like, oh, I just wish I could win the lottery. If I had money, I would just not do anything about this.
Yeah.
When you think of work as just this kind of terrible bore and responsibility that you kind of have to be subjected to, and it would be so much greater if you weren't. Going traveling really allows you to see that, okay, working for something is actually a crucial part of being satisfied with your life. And winning the lottery probably wouldn't actually be that much of a blessing, because, if you don't have a purpose in life, it's not satisfying.
Right.
One other great point that Branden makes in this section is living purposefully is important, because having a greater sense of purpose, long-term goals, short-term goals, something you're trying to accomplish, is a great way to evaluate decisions. So, am I going to do this? Am I not going to do this? You're confronted with a plethora of decisions every week, and your way to evaluate them is how they help you accomplish what you want to accomplish down the road. So, if your purpose is kind of long-term happiness, then you have something to evaluate by. If your purpose is, I want to make $50 million, you have something to evaluate your actions by. If you don't know what your purpose is, you have nothing to evaluate the decisions by.
Exactly. And you have nothing really to determine like if where you're currently at is where you want to be, because you don't have any like points that you're working towards or from.
Yeah. And purpose is vague, right? So like when I say, if you don't know what your purpose is, like, I don't know what my purpose is. Like, I have an idea, I have thoughts, I have feelings and a direction I want to go in, but I don't have like this smooth definition of it. So it's just a sense of what you want to do, a sense of who you want to become, and a kind of direction you're going in, not necessarily one simple one sentence answer to what is your purpose. And it will change over time.
Right. And there's so many different like concepts of this. It's so interesting. I know so much more about yoga now than I did when I did the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem the first time. And there's a Sanskrit word called dharma, which is this concept of what your purpose in life is. And finding your dharma is like finding this thing that you're really passionate about, that you have no doubt that you want to do forever. And it's something that I've sort of like played around with in my mind. Like, is there one thing that we're sort of meant to be doing, or that our path in life kind of takes us towards, or, how does that sort of work in life? And I feel like we really create our own opportunities and make our own choices. I don't think that your life path is set out for you by some big unknown. I don't think we're a game of Sims or anything like that. So really taking the responsibility to make your choices. And yeah, once again, I love the analogy of writing your own book. And I think that writing your own story leads so truthfully into living purposely, because you're creating like your own purpose in life and what you want out of your life, setting your own goals and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's something that you kind of, it's like, so you said writing your own story, like finding your purpose also incorporates looking back at the story that's been written so far. So like when you're traveling, you have space to kind of look back and say, what did I enjoy most about my life? What are my interests that have really pulled me? When you look backwards, you can kind of see, okay, these things seem to be the things that I lose myself doing. So I'm going to try to do that stuff more.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that another aspect of living purposely is also monitoring our actions to be sure we stay on track, which is like where the idea of goals sort of comes in, and then paying attention to outcomes to see, if we got to that place, and then going back to the drawing board to see if we need to reevaluate. And so I think that that's another thing to sort of acknowledge, is that, maybe you're out traveling and you become totally bored, and it gives you a chance to think about what you actually want to do with your life, and you set goals. And then maybe you realize that those aren't actually the things you want, a year or so down the road. That's not a bad thing either. You can just go back to that original sort of thought process and be like, okay, what do I want to do now? I think that that's something that people can get really attached to, is like, oh, I had this goal, but now I don't. So maybe I'm doing something wrong. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with changing your goals.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to hop into pillar number 6?
Yes. So pillar number 6 is the practice of personal integrity. And that's defined as living with congruence between what we know, what we profess, and what we do. Telling the truth, honoring our commitments, exemplifying in action the values we profess to admire.
Yeah, it's just really almost being like one person, not having what you think be different from how you act, not having the way you act be wildly different depending on the situation you're in. Obviously, depending on the group of people you're in, you're going to be slightly different. But the practice of personal integrity is acting on your principles and acting on what you think is right, regardless of the short-term benefits in the situation.
Totally. And I like to think about it as, acting the same way towards your best friend as you would towards your 90-year-old grandmother, as you would towards your boss. And obviously, or a coworker at work. And obviously there's different situations that are going to require you to act in slightly different ways, but to carry the exact same strain of values through each of those situations.
Yeah. And I think another important thing is that being integral is not about doing what feels easiest at the time. And so much of the time when you're kind of just like motoring on through life, we just choose what is in the short-term interests of ourselves. So that might be, having a bunch of drinks tonight because it feels good in the moment and it feels easier than like going home and dealing with discomfort you have in your life, or, you're at work and you're tired and you're like, oh, okay, I'm just going to like cut a corner here on closing something and not actually like finish it up well. All these opportunities where it might be easier in the moment or feel easier in the moment to just do something, but thinking it through, like what is like the actual right thing to do. And this has to be built upon actually having some concept of your own personal code of ethics. Like what is the way I want to live my life? So,
right. And I think about it as in like, sometimes like lying seems easier in the moment than telling the truth.
Yeah.
And I can think of a lot of instances in my life where maybe I have gone that route. Like I've taken the route of telling a small lie because it's easier in that moment and it's not going to hurt that person's feelings. But calling myself an honest person who doesn't lie to their friends or family. And I think that's not integral. If you want to say that you're an honest person, then you need to take the high road or the hard road and, tell the truth. I would say at least 95% of the time.
Yeah. So when you think about traveling and Six Pillars, how does integrity stack up? Or not, how does it relate? How is traveling conducive to integrity, or is it not as conducive as some of these other pillars are?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that when I sat down to think about how travel had impacted the 6 pillars of self-esteem, I found that integrity was the hardest one for me to think of a specific travel example where I was like, this really tested my integrity. I think that the biggest thing is that when you're not in a social situation that's familiar to you, and that you're not with, family or friends or coworkers that have expectations of you, and you're just with people who you're meeting, you kind of realize that, telling little lies or not being authentic or not honoring commitments just doesn't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it seems like it's just so much easier, when you're at home and your friend's like, hey, do you still want to go do this tonight? And you really just don't want to do it, but you're afraid of hurting their feelings. So you're like, oh, this thing came up that doesn't exist, or, oh, I feel really sick tonight. Like, can I take a rain check type thing, when really you just don't want to go. And, sitting in a hostel room and lying to your hostel roommate and being like, oh, I just really don't feel well tonight, seems so petty and stupid. Whereas it feels like sometimes the only option at home. And I think that was the biggest thing for me, is realizing like, oh, people actually like accept no as an answer, and people are okay if I tell the truth. And people are actually usually happier if you tell the truth and if you honor commitments, or if you explain why you didn't type thing.
Yeah. So you kind of brought up how good it feels to live with integrity. And I think travel is a big help in terms of recognizing that, like recognizing how good it feels to be living with a clean conscience. So I think that's a big way. And then this is also just something that builds off of the other stuff. So when you're living consciously, when you're doing a better job of accepting yourself, when you're taking responsibility, when you're being assertive, and you have a purpose, just to finish off the list, it's just much easier to act with integrity.
Right.
And acting with integrity isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. Like, it's not a switch you just decide to turn on. If you're really tired, if you're really busy, it's a lot harder than when you're clear conscious first thing in the morning you wake up. Easy to act on integrity. When you're burnt out, tired later on in the day, you've got a million things going on. It's quite a bit harder. So
yeah, definitely. And I think that the pillars really do kind of build off one another, because it's really hard to, like you said, act in integrity if you don't have all the other sort of base principles. And I feel like when you're doing all the other things, or you've engaged all of those, because you have this space while traveling or this time, then integrity kind of just falls into place, because all of a sudden you realize that not honoring commitments isn't being assertive, and it's not taking self-responsibility, and lying to people isn't authentic, and you're not engaging in self-acceptance, you're not living assertively, and you're not being integral for sure. And you kind of just realize that, the things that you were doing that felt so big at home are just actually really petty.
Yeah. But I do think this is an important one to point out that, or I guess I'll go back a second. I think that we've had a really good experience with this, going traveling for the first time. And at the end of our trip, we'd been out for 6 months. We'd been really clear-headed. We'd been living consciously, and doing some of these practices. And we kind of set out for ourselves, this is the way we want our lives to be back home.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got home and it kind of just like all went away.
It just like fell apart.
So that capstone of living with integrity wasn't there at all, because living with integrity is not about when it's easy. It's not about when you're traveling, it's quite a bit easier. So it's a good thing to practice, but when you're put in hard situations, that's really where like your integrity is tested. And so this is like a constant thing that's going to be coming up in your day-to-day life. And this is more of a come home thing. So we came home, weren't acting with integrity. 2 years later, go traveling again. And we're like, this is what happened the first time. We're not going to do that again. Like, we're going to set ourselves up in a way that allows us to live a life that's in accordance with our principles.
Totally. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is finding your core values, finding the things that are most important to you and sticking to those regardless of who thinks they're silly or who doesn't believe in them. And, you know, that kind of ties the entire thing together. If you're confident in your core values and in yourself, and you've built up your self-esteem, then it doesn't really matter what other people think. It's all coming from within yourself.
Okay. So yeah, just to get into wrap up mode, the 6 pillars are living consciously, self-acceptance, self-responsibility, self-assertiveness, living purposefully, practice of integrity.
Boom.
And after going traveling and spending quite a bit of time traveling, both of our experience has been that long-term travel has been the best way for us to work on these practices. And it's just an environment that's really conducive to practicing these things and to building self-esteem. And I think that it varies which of the pillars are most conducive. Like, I think living consciously, you're going to get that when you go traveling.
Yeah.
Living with integrity,
got to work a little harder for that one.
That's it, not as easy. But Six Pillars of Self-Esteem is definitely a book we recommend checking out. It's had a big impact on the way I think. Would you?
Yeah, the way I think as well. So
we're going to drop a link to that, as well as there's a podcast called the School Sucks Podcast that has a really thorough breakdown of the 6 pillars. They've done an episode on each and a really good discussion. So that's a really good place to check out if you're interested in thinking more about self-esteem as a framework for improving your satisfaction with life.
Yeah, and just one more like plug for the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem is it's not simply just a self-development book. It's also got some really great exercises to work on. Branden calls them sentence stem exercises. They're stuff that both Ryan and I have done, and they've been super, super, super helpful for both of us, just in terms of like, you know, just when you have a moment where you slip up a little bit because you're human and you're not going to be perfect ever. And it's like, okay, let's just remind myself of what I'm going to be responsible for myself for today.
Yeah. And so we'd definitely be really curious to hear from you guys, which of these 6 practices you feel like travel has made the most impact on your life with. If you feel like some of these aren't actually congruent with travel, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. We always love to hear from you. We'll always respond to you, even if it takes us a little bit to get back to you. Yeah. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thank you. To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at World Wanderers 1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.